Now, in this lesson, we are going to discuss gender versus sex, biological and social constructs. The distinction between gender and sex has been one of the most critical debates in academic discourse since the later half of the 20th century. While the categories of male and female, man and woman were assumed to correspond seamlessly to biological differences, scholars of sociology, anthropology, feminist theory, and queer studies have challenged such existentialist thinking. The terms sex and gender, though often used interchangeably in everyday discourse, refer to distinct yet interconnected phenomena. Sex is conventionally understood in biological terms, grounded in chromosomal, hormonal, and anatomical characteristics, while gender, in contrast, refers to social and cultural constructions of identity, behavior, and roles associated with masculinity and femininity. This we have discussed in length in the last class. The evolution of the sex-gender distinction highlights how biology and culture interact, overlap, and sometimes conflict in the making of human identity. These debates have significant implications for issues of equality, policy, law, and human rights. By unpacking biological and social constructs, scholars reveal how seemingly natural categories are often shaped by ideology and power. This class here explores the conceptual boundaries between sex and gender, analyze their intersection and divergences, and situates them within the larger discussion of identity and social justice. Today we'll also examine critiques of binary framework, particularly from intersex, transgender and queer perspectives, which demonstrate that both sex and gender resist neat categorization. The biological basis of sex is traditionally defined as a biological distinction between male and female. This distinction has been based on observable characteristics such as reproductive anatomy and secondary sexual traits, and also chromosomal composition. We all know XS chromosomes are typically associated with females while XY chromosomes are associated with males. Hormonal differences such as high level of estrogen in females and testosterone in males reinforce these categories. Biological essentialism, the belief that physical characteristics naturally determine behavioral, social and intellectual differences, dominated the scientific and cultural discourse for centuries. This assumption was that biology dictated destiny. Women were naturally nurturing and suited for domestic life, and men were naturally rational and suited for leadership. Such assumptions were again further institutionalized in medicine, education, and law. However, the contemporary research complicates this binary. The existence of intersex individuals, those born with variations in chromosomes, gonads, or genitalia that do not fit typical definitions of male or female, demonstrate that biological sex itself exists on a spectrum. And Foster Sterling argues that nature produces diversity, but societies often force individuals into rigid categories, leading to medical interventions that normalize their bodies. Similarly, biological sex traits such as hormone levels vary across individuals and populations, undermining rigid male-female binaries. Thus, while sex is rooted in biology, it is not immune from cultural and media interpretation. What societies consider male or female bodies are in part the results of classificatory practices shaped by social and political interest. The social construction of gender refers to the roles, behaviors, and expectations situations and performances that cultures attach to sex categories. Unlike sex, gender is not biologically determined, but it is socially learned and enforced. Simone de Beauvoir famously declared in her book The Second Sex that one is not born but rather becomes a woman. This statement encapsulates the idea that gender identity and roles are a product of socialization rather than biological destiny. From early childhood, individuals internalize norms about how boys and girls should behave and conduct themselves. Toys, clothing, and language reinforce these norms. Girls are encouraged to play with dolls and wear pink, while boys are given trucks, guns, and action figures. These early cues establish gender roles that persist throughout life, influencing career choices, family responsibilities, and self-presentation. Judith Butler, in her book Gender Trouble, advanced the idea of gender performity, arguing that gender is not a stable identity but an ongoing performance sustained through repeated acts. For Butler, gender is not something one is but something one does, produced through cultural repetition. This performative model highlights the fluidity of gender and its dependence on societal reinforcement. Cultural variation underscores the constructed nature of gender. In some indigenous North American societies, two-spirit individuals occupied roles outside the Western male-female binary. In South Asia, Hijra communities historically held spiritual and cultural roles that were distinct from binary gender categories. These examples reveal to us that gender roles and identities are historically and culturally specific, not universal truths. Intersections of gender and sex, although conceptually distinct, sex and gender intersect in complex societies. Societies often presume that biological sex determines gender identity, but this assumption does not hold universally. For instance, transgender individuals may identify with a gender different from their assigned biological sex, demonstrating that identity transcends physical categorization. Moreover, medical and legal institutions often conflict sex and gender, reinforcing binary divisions. Policies requiring individuals to list sex on legal documents such as birth certificates, passports, and identity cards illustrate how categories become socially and politically significant. Similarly, debates upon sports eligibility also highlight how biology and gender intersect, raising questions about inclusion, fairness, and bodily autonomy. Scholars argue that while sex may have biological underpinnings, its interpretation is mediated by culture. For example, menstruation and menopause are biological processes, but their social meaning, stigmatization, silence, or even celebration vary across societies. In this sense, sex and gender are mutually constitutive and biology shapes experience, but culture shapes meaning. Foster Sterling proposes the recognition of multiple sexes, arguing that the two-sex model is inadequate to capture natural diversity. Similarly, queer theory critiques binary understandings of gender. Eva Kosowski-Sedgwick in Epistemology of the Closest show how Western thought relies on dichotomies, for example male-female, homo-hetero, that fail to account for the fluidity of identity. Transgender perspectives also highlight the limitations of binary thinking. For trans individuals, identity is not necessarily tied to biology but to lived experience and self-identification. This recognition challenges medicalized definitions of sex and demands legal and cultural frameworks that accommodate diverse identities. Biological determinism versus social construction. Now, this debate over sex and gender often maps onto broader disputes between biological determinism versus social constructionism. Now, what is biological determinism? Biological determinists argue that it is the physical differences which dictate behavior and social roles, while social constructionists contend that cultural context shapes identity. For instance, that men are naturally more aggressive or the women are naturally more empathetic reflect biological determinism. Yet, cross-cultural studies show significant variation in gender behavior, suggesting that culture also plays a key role. Margaret Mead's anthropological research in sex and temperament in three primitive societies demonstrated that traits considered masculine or feminine in Western societies were distributed differently in other cultures. Most contemporary scholars adopt a middle ground, recognizing the biology and cultural intersection. Biology provides possibilities and constraints while culture interprets, amplifies or suppresses these traits. For example, testosterone may influence aggression, but cultural norms determine whether aggression is valorized or condemned. Let's understand the role of institutions in constructing gender and sex. Institutions such as family, education, religion and the state play a crucial role in constructing and enforcing distinctions between sex and gender. Families socialize children into gender roles, schools reinforce gender divisions of labor, and religious doctrines often prescribe roles for men and women based on assumed natural differences. Media often plays a central role in perpetuating gender norms. Representations of women as caregivers and men as leaders reinforce cultural expectations even when real-life experiences diverge. Advertising industries, for example, have historically marketed cleaning products to women and cars to men, naturalizing divisions of labor. The state also enforces sex and gender categories through law. For instance, laws which regulate marriage, reproduction and workplace equality hinge on distinctions between male and female, masculine and feminine. These legal frameworks both reflect and reinforce cultural assumptions about sex and gender. Intersectionality and gendered experience, which was pioneered by Kimberly Crenshaw, emphasizes that gender cannot be understood in isolation from race, class, sexuality and other axes of identity. For instance, the experience of a white middle-class woman differs significantly from those of a black working-class woman. Both face sexism, but their experiences of gender oppression are shaped by race and class. Intersectional analysis complicates the distinction between gender and sex by showing that identity is multi-layered. While sex may provide a biological foundation, its social meanings vary across contexts. For example, reproductive roles may be valued differently in different cultural or economic settings. Similarly, access to healthcare, education and employment opportunities mediates how gender is lived. Contemporary debates in the 21st century, debates about how sex and gender have entered mainstream politics and public life. The recognition of transgender rights, same-sex marriage, and non-binary identities reflect broader cultural shifts towards inclusivity. Yet, these shifts have also produced backlash, with conservative movements seeking to reinforce traditional gender roles. Sports provide one of the most contested arenas. Questions about whether transgender women should compete in women's categories raise tensions between inclusion and perceived fairness. Similarly, debates about bathroom access for transgender individuals reveal how sex and gender remain deeply political. Medical debates also persist. Should sex reassignment surgeries or hormone therapies be considered a necessary medical care, or it can be something like an elective procedure? These questions highlight the intersection of biology, culture, and rights while defining sex and gender. Now, let's try to understand implications for equality and human rights. The distinction between sex and gender has profound implications for equality and human rights. Recognizing gender as a social construct undermines the arguments that inequality is natural or inevitable. It supports claims for women's rights, LGBTQI rights, and broader gender justice. And at the same time, it acknowledges the complexity of biological sex, which prevents oversimplification. Recognizing intersex individuals and protecting their rights require rejecting these rigid binary categories. Similarly, supporting transgender rights necessitates the understanding that self-identification transcends biological determinism. By distinguishing sex and gender while recognizing their intersections, society can build more inclusive policies and institutions. Such recognize challenges systems of oppression rooted in patriarchal, heteronormative, and binary frameworks. To conclude, the distinction between sex and gender reveals the interplay of biology and culture in shaping human identity. While sex is often defined in biological terms, its meanings are socially mediated. Gender, as a cultural construct, structures roles, expectations, and performances. Together, they form the foundation of identity but resist rigid categorization. Critics of binary frameworks from intersex, transgender, and queer perspectives highlight the limitations of existentialist thinking. Intersectional analysis further shows that experiences of sex and gender vary across race, class, and culture. Contemporary debates in law, medicine, politics, and sports illustrate the urgency of these questions for equality and justice. Ultimately, understanding gender and sex as both biological and social constructs allows for a more inclusive version of humanity. It challenges naturalized hierarchies, affirms diversity, and opens possibilities for reimagining identity beyond rigid binaries. In this lesson, we have cited works from Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, Kimberly Crenshaw's Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color, Frosto Sterling Aday's Sexing the Body, Gender Politics and the Construction of Sexuality, and Michael Foucault's History of Sexuality and Introduction.